Going out to the questions we had yesterday, again, we talked about salvation and the atonement, and since you won't just have me here, you can throw in your sense worth as well. But we wanted to get through these because it is going to come up, and these are relevant issues, especially not just when talking to skeptics and the secular crowd that will say, I'm basically a good person, but also those who would be in the atheist or anti-theist crowd, those in hostility or objection to Christianity. This one, again, I've heard more than once, where the objection to the Christian idea of salvation, the idea of making it absurd and therefore something foolish to believe in, is that if your Christian narrative is true, if Genesis is in fact history, then putting the pieces together, didn't God commit entrapment? Because according to Genesis, he put the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the cause of all of our problems, in the middle of the garden so that Adam and Eve could get at it at any time. And since withholding knowledge from them, that was enabling them to make a decision without full knowledge or awareness of its consequences. And of course, allowing the serpent to go in, don't you think that God would be working through the serpent to try and set them up to fail so that he could quote-unquote save them from a situation he put them through? It's essentially another jab at the internet meme. Let me into your heart and save you. From what? For what I'm going to do to you if you don't let me into your heart and save you. It's ultimately attributing malice to the God of the Bible. So if we're going to, of course, handle these kind of objections, the first thing to do is ask, are you representing the scenario properly? Or are you playing fast and loose with certain details to make the situation seem more foolish than it is? So note the variables: that God committed entrapment, that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was accessible, that Adam and Eve didn't have knowledge of the consequences, didn't have access to a better option, and that, of course, that the Lord and Satan were in cahoots. It's really hard to prove the last one, so we'll put that in the neutral territory for now. But let's start with what entrapment actually is and see if it fits the scenario. The legal definition of entrapment, according to legaldictionary.net, is when a law enforcement official persuades or encourages a person to commit a crime he would not otherwise do. So you have to have the persuasion of the law enforcement officer in order to allow this for a charge of entrapment to be taking place here. And if you need a second, you can go to law@cornell.edu. The legal definition of entrapment is an affirmative defense in which a defendant alleges that a law enforcement agent or a agent of the state induced the defendant to commit a crime. So pretty consistent understanding that in order for entrapment to be the case, you have to not say that the serpent persuaded Adam and Eve, according to Genesis chapter 3. It was really just Eve. What would have to be entrapment in this case? God would have had to have persuaded Adam and Eve to, of course, eat of the fruit. The word entrapment, much like the term genocide that's being thrown out in the internet today, is dependent on us not knowing what that actually means. You watch the police cop videos where they don't want to get arrested, so they say, I can't breathe. If you can scream, you can breathe. Yeah. This is entrapment. No, you're literally trying to hide the marijuana from your pocket. That's the idea here. So the word is being misused. That would be the first critique of that objection to the atonement. But what about that other stat, that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was, of course, not only made accessible to Adam and Eve, but this whole idea of it being built up, that they didn't know that it was any better or any different than the tree of life that God also put in the midst of the garden. Well, let's throw that aside.
Well, yeah.
What's the real issue?
Yeah, I guess what the real issue is this: although Adam and Eve did not have the knowledge of good and evil as it is described there, it didn't mean they didn't know anything. In fact, they did know some things about that tree. For instance, some very important things about eating of the fruit of that tree. For instance, in Genesis chapter 3, Satan doesn't start out by saying, hey, you really ought to eat from that tree in the midst of the garden. His first thing was, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And notice Eve's response. We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God says you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die.
So Eve had a vague understanding of the consequences, and which was referencing the previous chapter before the serpent showed up.
Right. And when the serpent shows up, when the serpent raises the issue about, well, is God potentially holding out on you? Eve first affirmed that they could eat of any other fruit that was in the garden, but there was one tree that God had specifically told them not to eat from, lest they die. Now, it wasn't the fruit of that tree that killed them, in a sense. It was the disobedience to God that eating of that fruit brought upon them that did the damage. So why have that tree in the midst of the garden? Well, once again, it comes down to this. In order to have real love, you have to have a choice. You have to have a choice to accept or reject that relationship. And part and parcel of a real love relationship is trusting the person that you're entering into the love relationship with. You can decide not to trust them. You decide to say, well, I don't believe them. But once again, that tells you something about the nature of the relationship, whether it's solid or whether it's broken or not. To say that, gosh, it would be much better if God hadn't given Adam and Eve the opportunity to be able to disobey. Well, can you think of any other love relationship you'd like to have operate by those rules? Would you, again, to use the famous analogy from the Twilight Zone, get a love potion that will guarantee that the object of your affections will madly love you forever? Well, in that episode of the Twilight Zone, it worked at first, and the guy was so happy that this woman finally loved him and didn't treat him like dirt anymore. But then after a while, he realized, wait a minute, it isn't this woman that's loving me, it's the potion. And so he bought the potion for $1, went back to the place where he bought the potion and said, well, do you have an antidote? And the guy said, yeah. And he started handing him out. Go, oh, no, it's not $1. It's $10,000 for the antidote. And the guy said, $10,000. He goes, we've never had anyone turn us down. Why? Because love that's not freely given isn't real love. Same situation going on in the Garden of Eden. In order to say yes to a relationship with God, a love relationship with God that was real and legitimate, there also had to be the possibility of saying no. Now, that ability to say no came with enough knowledge about what the consequences were of saying no that Adam and Eve could not say, we didn't understand. Notice when Adam and Eve fell, they had all kinds of excuses, all kinds of finger pointing and blaming at each other, at the snake, but no one blamed God. They realized that God was completely innocent in this set of circumstances. He was completely just in this circumstance. And believe me, if Adam and Eve could have pointed at God, Adam even sort of obliquely says, the woman whom you gave me of the fruit and I ate. In other words, if God was to blame for anything, it was bringing this woman into the garden, not bringing the tree into the garden. So, when those people say, oh, it was entrapment or it was a setup, the people on the ground certainly didn't think so.
And they were a bit smarter than us, but here's another, I guess, 2 more monkey wrenches before we move on to the last objection. When you put together this scenario where God's really the secret bad guy and you have to present him as basically speaking through the serpent rather than the accuser, and of course you have to rewrite all of biblical history and all biblical narratives into saying that, well, God clearly is going to want to do this so that his plans can ultimately be fulfilled. The end justifies the means. Well, if you're going to say that his revelation of his character, that the idea that he had in mind was his ultimate glorification, was the best possible scenario, which we'd agree to biblically. God is first and foremost interested in his glory, his nature. What is that passage again? In the Gospel of James, chapter 1 and verse 16 through 17, where we're given a description of God's nature as not tempting anyone to do evil.
God isn't tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone.
Or when a man is tempted, he is drawn away by his own desires.
Right, and enticed. Yeah.
So if you're going to pick and choose which aspects of the Bible you're going to affirm in order to agree with your theory, then why can't I pick and choose the areas of the Bible that affirm my theory? And suddenly you're cherry picking. You're not representing the whole story and narrative, but it's exactly what you're doing. And the second issue with all of this is if you're going to attribute malice to God, which is a non-starter, if you're going to say they didn't have access to information beforehand, which is false, read Genesis 2:9, if you're going to say that they didn't know that their actions would have consequences because they were kept from the knowledge of good and evil, first of all, they had knowledge, as we've talked about. They were able to, Adam in particular, name each and every animal according to its kind before the introduction even of his wife, noting his productivity there. And we're also noting as well their capacity to know and fellowship with God. So they knew what good was. They had its source firsthand. What was introduced at the garden? It wasn't the knowledge of good and evil. It was the reception of evil.
Right.
That's the scenario
Right.
here.
Yeah.
But here's where it ultimately falls apart. If we're going to actually take this at face value and say that God was setting up some grander plan, that the ends justified the means, well, here's the problem. Why would God introduce a system where the ultimate party who would face the most expense, who would have to deal with the most fallout, the most repercussions of this, wasn't the adversary, wasn't mankind, it was him? Because in order to redeem mankind
Right.
from what he allegedly set them up to do, his son would have to go on a cruel Roman cross, face an eternity's worth of suffering, and then rise from the dead, ultimately, to have to deal with atheists like you that blaspheme him for it. Your move. So when we're talking about this scenario, again, if you play by their rules and it's even more ridiculous than how they're trying to make it sound, you need more information. If you have to deliberately hide information in order to actually get to the heart of what they're trying to say, and if they don't even get words right, like entrapment, which would require God himself to say, eat that tree. You wouldn't have done it otherwise. Do that. And have some claim of
completely
bizarre
violates
sovereignty.
those rules. Yeah.
When we have descriptions of God's character that wouldn't do that by definition.
Right.
You have the burden of proof to literally recreate our whole religion, our whole theology, in order to make that fit.